Frankenstein's Aunt by Rune Pettersson. The Werewolf. She heard the howling again, long, drawn-out and plaintive as it echoed round the mountains in a hollow, ghost-like manner, then blended with the baying of dogs that had now come even closer. Perhaps it had been a dog howling after all. But in that case, who had let the dog in the first place? Because she could now hear quite clearly that the howling was coming from up in the East Tower. For a moment, Hannah Frankenstein became very frightened. Then she persuaded herself that this was all absolute nonsense and strode along the path above the precipice. When she came around the moss-covered tool shed that leaned drunkenly against the west wall of the castle, she saw the torches. Through the briars she and Igor had recently tamed, she saw a wavering mass of flames marching up toward the castle, and again she heard the baying of hounds. So the hunt was coming in this direction. She could feel her nose turning ice cold with fury. So these ruffians weren't going to give her a chance either. Well, she would show them. Swiftly, she ran over to the kitchen entrance and shouted for Igor, who came hobbling out into the murk with a lighted paraffin lamp in his hand. "Yes," he said, sounding frightened. "Is the monster asleep?" "He's just woken up. Whatever happens, see he stays indoors. On no account must he be let out of the castle. The torches are on the march again." "I saw them, missus," said Igor in a worried voice. Aunt Frankenstein slammed the kitchen door shut, gave a twitch of her bun to make sure it was in reasonable order, and then, upright and dignified, she walked to the front entrance, looking very smart in her black costume. She stood, waiting on the front doorway, her feet astride, her arms crossed. She was icy calm now, knowing perfectly well what role she was going to play. The audience could come. The first of them came up the slope, a group of dogs ahead, 2 Alsatians, 2 hounds, and an old bulldog, all on leashes. Well, the Alsatians were eagerly dragging their owners along by their leashes. The bulldog looked like an ancient piece of furniture, longing to be put in a museum. Just behind the dogs came a man she at once recognized. The guard. His face was red and shiny from all the strain and excitement, his yellow mustache hanging like a dead leaf beneath his nose, and his Tyrolean hat askew. He seemed rather askew himself, too, and was taking bandy-legged sidesteps in his huntsman's green knickers. Behind him came a wall of large men she did not recognize, all of them holding burning torches in their hands, their faces red and glowing in the light of the flames. The massed standards of torches swayed and fluttered down the hillside as far as the eye could see, snaking their way all along the road. Now she realized what the fire was that she had seen in the valley. The procession came to the front of the castle and stopped, the dogs snapping and snarling. The torch-bearers murmured excitedly, their light falling on the weed-filled gravel patch in front of the entrance and on Hannah Frankenstein's boots. The guard again noticed his own shoes were 5 sizes smaller, and that annoyed him very much indeed. He hooked his thumbs into his belt loops and said in a shrill voice, "You no doubt know why we've come?" "No, I certainly do not," said Hannah Frankenstein. "So we meet again so soon, do we?" "The pleasure is all yours," said the guard rudely. "Come to the point," said Hannah Frankenstein. "What do you want?" She took out a cigar and asked the nearest torchbearer for a light, but he seemed insulted by her boldness. In the crowd behind the guard, she recognized the station master and the village innkeeper. The excited muttering grumbled on down the hill, the torches flaring against the night sky. From beneath his Tyrolean hat, the guard fixed her with his swimming eyes. He was apparently more than half in the bag. You've woken up the monster?" Actually, he says this in a really funny accent. Let's try this again. "You've woken up the monster?" he said indirectly, pointing at her. "Can you deny it?" he hiccuped. "No, I can't," said Hannah Frankenstein. "But I have to inform you that was not my original intention." She heard a raucous laugh from down the hill, and someone shouted, "Tell that to the Marines!" "As I said," Hannah Frankenstein raised her voice. That was not my original intention. It was not until I saw what a state the castle was in that I realized I had to have the help of a pair of supernaturally strong arms. But I assure you... She was interrupted again by a man shouting, The value of our houses goes down when we have to live near a monster. Another shouted, Go home and take the monster with you. The muttering rose to deafening proportions, and Aunt Frankenstein had to shout to be heard, Gentlemen, I assure you, the monster will not be allowed to leave the grounds this time. You can sleep safely down there in the village. Monster is going to help me restore the castle, that's all. But it was like talking to a burning brick wall. The monster must go, shouted a deep-bass voice. That was the fair-haired blacksmith, who was standing some way down the hill, his torch looking like an outsized match in his hand. Gentlemen, Aunt Frankenstein said again, listen to what I have to say. Listen carefully to what I have to say. Don't think for one moment I'm defending my nephew. No, Henry is a good-for-nothing, and I agree. But I've come here to put things right again. That's why I'm here. To clear the family name. There's not enough soap and water in the whole of Bavaria to do that, said the guard, his eyes sparkling. When he heard the laughter his remark caused, he looked around with satisfaction, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders now. Aunt Frankenstein felt like pulling his Tyrolean hat down over his ears, but she controlled herself. That would hardly have helped her cause. She glared at the nearest men, looking sharply from one to the next, and avoided looking at the guard so as not to get too angry. Are you all without faults yourselves? She barked. Are you all as pure as the driven snow? Have you never tried to avoid paying taxes? Have you never driven when you've had one too many, or even set up a still of your own? The guard stiffened. He had a small still at home down in his cellar. Did she know anything? No, that wasn't possible, but he'd better go into the attack at once. He raised his forefinger in the air and shouted, The monster must go! Yes, they all yelled, the monster must go! Remember, said the guard grandly, hooking his thumbs into his suspenders again. This is the area with traditions. This is an area with traditions and culture. In that castle, he pointed, in that castle, Lord Byron and the great poet Shelley once stayed the night. For God's sake. For God's sake, Fritz, hissed the innkeeper behind him. Lord Byron and Shelley, they're called. Well, anyway, they stayed the night there, once on their way to Switzerland, said the guard sullenly. As if I didn't know that, said Hannah Frankenstein emphatically. The Frankenstein family is related to Shelley's wife. The innkeeper thrust his shiny face forward, his mustache long and black in the torchlight. But then your Frankensteins started getting up to all this mischief, and that was the end of poetry. That's when Philistinism came to the village. Exactly, said the guard. That's when Philistinism came to the village, when you came. Aunt Frankenstein felt as if she had been struck on the head by lightning, that nasty little bully saying that, and he presumably couldn't even spell the word culture. The next moment, scarcely knowing where the words came from, she heard herself saying, Now listen to me. Before the end of the summer, I will invite you all to a party here at the castle, and then, I guarantee, you'll hear monster reciting poems by Shelley. In reply came a great deal of crude laughter and scornful remarks from down on the slope. But the men standing nearest to her were staring beyond her. When she turned, she saw Franz running toward her in the gathering dark, his shirt torn and his hair standing on end. She had completely forgotten about him. Aunt, he yelled, he's got out. But I told Igor to lock him in, said Aunt Frankenstein almost desperately. Not monster, stammered Franz. It's Talbot who's got out. At that moment they heard the sound of windows shattering in the castle, and broken glass showered down into the undergrowth, followed by a dark figure who landed on all fours with a heavy thud. It rose and came toward them, crouching and walking with long, jerky, gliding strides. The flickering torchlight fell on him, and Hannah Frankenstein saw that he was unusually hairy. He was wearing nothing but a pair of trousers. His eyes, glittering in the torchlight, were not human, nor were his nose and mouth. Glittering white fangs protruded from the most prominent lower jaw she had seen for a long time. A great wave of terror ran through the recently so aggressive crowd, and shrill voices cried everywhere, "The Werewolf! It's the Werewolf! Run for your lives!" The crowd had already dispersed in wild flight down the hill, and that's the end of that chapter.